Good morning. My name is Eve Studi, and I'm the designated federal officer for the 2020 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, and I'm also the lead nutritionist for nutrition guidance at USDA's Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion. It is really my pleasure to welcome everyone, both here in the audience and those of you online, to the first meeting of the 2020 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. We are really so excited to get this work underway, and we thank you for your interest in your work in this process. I do want to start with just a couple of housekeeping items. For those of you here in person, you'll notice that we have badges. You need to have either a USDA official badge or that sticker to go through the halls of this building, so please keep that sticker on. It designates to security that you are a part of this group. Also, you'll notice that some people have blue dots. Those blue dots indicate that they are staff. It also says staff. So if you have any questions at all, please reach out to a member of the staff and they can help you or they can direct you to someone who can assist you. Now, finally, if you need some refreshments or lunch later, the cafeteria is down wing 3. Now, we are all here with a common goal to improve the health of our nation. We know that what we eat and drink matters, and yet we know that we are very far behind in meeting the dietary guidelines. On average, Americans have a score of a 59. Americans have an average score of a 59 out of 100 on the Healthy Eating Index. If you look at the left-hand side, that graph there, it shows that Healthy Eating Index scores have increased slightly over the last 10 years. And on the right-hand side, you can see that Healthy Eating Index scores are slightly higher among our youngest and our oldest Americans, but overall, there is a lot of room for improvement. And yet research shows us that moving towards a healthy diet, a diet that aligns with the dietary guidelines, can have health as well as economic benefits in terms of healthcare costs. The dietary guidelines are mandated to reflect the preponderance of scientific evidence and to be published jointly by the Departments of Agriculture and Health and Human Services at least every 5 years. And it's important to re-examine the evidence to provide current, credible, science-based advice to all Americans now from birth into older adulthood. We want to set the stage by saying that USDA and HHS are committed to ensuring that our process to develop the 2020-2025 Dietary Guidelines for Americans is transparent, inclusive, and science-driven. And those are 3 terms that really drive our work on a daily basis, and you'll hear more about how we're working to address these goals throughout the presentations today and tomorrow. So for our agenda today, this morning we'll have some opening remarks and formal swearing in of the committee. That will be followed by a quick break. And then I'll do an overview of the committee's charter, operations, and timeline, and that'll be followed by remarks by our chair and vice chair, and then lunch. And then this afternoon, I'll begin with the presentation around responding, the department's response, USDA and HHS's responses to the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine study on the process to establish the dietary guidelines for Americans. We will then get into a discussion about the approaches that the committee will use to examine the evidence. So that includes the Nutrition Evidence Systematic Review, formerly known as the Nutrition Evidence Library, or NEL. As well as data analysis and food pattern modeling. We'll also have a discussion about a new step that we're implementing, which is the peer review of the systematic reviews conducted by the 2020 Advisory Committee. Then I'll close the day with a little bit of a discussion about opportunities for public engagement throughout this process before we close for today. Now, for the public record, maybe I should note too that the agenda is available at dietaryguidelines.gov. We will post the recording of this meeting as well as all of the slides and any of the materials that are used today at dietaryguidelines.gov. Please allow 1 to 2 weeks for posting just so we have all those pieces. We will also have meeting minutes from this meeting and eventually a transcript, but that will take a little bit longer for us to get posted. For the public record, 17 of our 20 members are here with us today, who Mr. Lips will introduce shortly. Doctors Donovan, Naomi, and Tavares were not able to be here today, but they will tune in as they are able. Should they have any questions or comments during the committee's discussion, they will send them to one of our colleagues, Stephanie Fu, who will come to this podium and speak on their behalf. Please note that this is a meeting of the committee that is open to the public to observe. If you have any comments to the committee, we encourage you to submit those through the written public comment process so they become an official part of the public record. We will also have 2 opportunities for the public to provide oral comments to the committee. We had 1 last round, and we're going to have 2 this round, and we'll talk more about that later today and at dietaryguidelines.gov. So we're so happy to have our leadership from USDA and HHS here with us today to kick off this exciting phase of our process. I'm pleased to introduce Brandon Lips, Acting Deputy Undersecretary of the USDA Food, Nutrition, and Consumer Services Mission Area and Administrator of the Food Nutrition Service, or FNS. As you may be aware, FNS is the lead agency from USDA for the 2020-2025 Dietary Guidelines process. Acting Deputy Undersecretary Lips joined USDA in 2017 from Texas Tech University System, where he was the Chief of Staff and Director of Federal Affairs in the Office of the Chancellor. Before that, he served as counsel and senior professional staff to the U.S. House Committee on Agriculture, where he led the nutrition policy team in developing key initiatives in nutrition assistance. We really appreciate Mr. Lips' leadership here at FNS, and please join me in welcoming him.
Good morning. Good morning. That's better. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. Thanks, Dr. Sudi, for that kind introduction. On behalf of Secretary Perdue, who couldn't be with us here today, he is on travel, I want to welcome everybody, our committee and our audience, to the first meeting of the 2020 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. Many thanks to Dr. Don Wright from the Department of Health and Human Services for their great partnership in this process, and for Dr. Hutchins from our REE mission area here at USDA for joining us today. They're going to give you comments in just a few minutes on their perspectives as well. Very excited to announce we have more than 1,000 people joining us today in this room and also by webcast. The participation by the public is a very important part in this process. You will hear us talk over and over about ways that we have increased transparency in this process. I think the process has done a wonderful job in the past. Many folks didn't know how to access many of the transparent opportunities that were in various places on our website. We have worked on revamping much of that stuff and provided more opportunities from input, beginning with listening sessions prior to putting the questions out for public comment and continuing as we go throughout this process. Committee members, we're excited that you're all here today. I'm very excited that 17 of you were able to travel here relatively quickly for the first meeting of the committee today. We've asked for a significant commitment from each of you. You've accepted our invitation, and we thank you. You all have very important roles in your day jobs, and we thank you for the time that you have committed here. The next phase we're kicking off today, the departments collectively are asking you, as scientific experts in nutrition and public health, to conduct an independent, rigorous review of the scientific evidence. Your role is to examine that science. Our roles at USDA and HHS are to develop the dietary guidelines, and we take our roles just as seriously as we believe that you do. Every federal nutrition program and all federal nutrition activities nationwide rely on the dietary guidelines. It impacts millions of lives, and for the first time, the 2020 to 2025 edition will do so from birth to adulthood, the entire lifespan. At USDA, this means programs and initiatives like our Women, Infants, and Children, often known as WIC program, will be more heavily influenced by the dietary guidelines. Our Child and Adult Care Food Program, which provides important nutrition to children in daycare, both public and in-home throughout the country. Our SNAP education initiatives, which provide important nutrition advice to those on our SNAP program. And of course, My Plate, the nutrition resource for all consumers, as the public looks to us for nutrition advice on how to eat a healthy diet. It goes without saying, Eve said it, I told you we would say it again, but it's imperative that our process be transparent and that it be evidence-based. We must ensure that what we put into the guidelines is grounded in the latest science, not the latest study to hit the headlines. The latest science across studies, over time, and of high quality. Thank you, committee, again for taking on this very important role. It is a difficult role and one that will take much time commitment from you, and we appreciate you providing that. We are committed to making the process and the work of this committee to be transparent and inclusive every step of the way. Since the process started to develop the 2020 to 2025 dietary guidelines early last year, we have worked hard to make sure of that, fostering public trust and input. We've built transparency into every stage of the process. We've improved how we make it available, and moves as simple as redesigning our website. We want the public to comment. The public comment period for this phase of the process opened on March 12th and will remain open for the entire time the committee is doing its work. All of you listening today, we ask you to comment on this process every step along the way. There will also be opportunities for oral comments to the committee at 2 of our hearings. After the committee submits its reports to us and disbands, and the public comment period closes, we will open a new public comment period on this scientific report provided from the committee. All told, from the start of this process, where we saw public input on the topics and questions, the committee will examine, because they're important to the dietary guidelines we will develop, to our call for nominations for advisory committee members, to the public comment periods that I've just talked about. We have made sure that the public will have had about 2 years to participate in this process. Transparent, inclusive, and science-driven. That's our commitment both to you, the committee, and to the public as this process moves forward. At this time, I have the great pleasure of introducing the committee. As I say each of your names, I would appreciate you standing up, and for those of you in the audience, I would appreciate you holding your applause until we finish introducing all members. I want to first welcome the chair of our committee, Dr. Barbara Schneeman. Dr. Schneeman, thank you for your willingness to lead this incredible effort. Along with her, our vice chair, Dr. Ron Kleinman. Dr. Kleinman, thank you as well for this very important role. Y'all please stay standing. You can have the joy of standing as all your partners go. Also serving on the committee, Dr. Heather Leidy. Dr. Joanne Sabate. Dr. Carol Boucher, Dr. Regan Bailey, Dr. Jamie Ard, Dr. Elizabeth Meyer Davis, Dr. Stephen Heimsfeld, Dr. Catherine Dewey, Dr. Lydia Bazzano, Dr. Richard Mattis, Dr. Rachel Novotny, Dr. Linda Van Horn, Dr. Teresa Davis, Dr. Linda Schnetzler, and Dr. Jamie Stang. Joining us remotely are Dr. Elsie Taveras, Dr. Shannon Donovan, and Dr. Tim Naemi. Committee members, thank you all very much for volunteering your valuable time to this very important process. We look forward to your independent review of the process and your recommendations to the departments. Please give a healthy round of applause to our committee members. You can be seated. I felt a little bit like I was back in my old job calling names coming across the stage. Thank you for welcoming our committee. It's now my pleasure to ask the chair and vice chair to come forward and stand with me as we administer the oath of office to the committee. Dr. Schneeman and Dr. Kleinman and other committee members, please raise your right hand. Both of you, please come over here. Yeah. This one. I'll pause after each line. I state your name, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to same, that I take this obligation freely, without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which I am about to enter. So help me God. Thank you, everyone. You may take your seats. In closing this portion, again, committee, I want to thank you for your willingness to serve. We are going to thank you often. We have very high expectations of you, and we know we are asking a lot of time commitment to you. So thank you again for that. Thank you for your expertise in your fields and your commitment to ensuring dedication to public health. It is now time for you to hear from my colleague at the Department of Health and Human Services, Dr. Don Wright. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Wright. He is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Health and Director of the Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion, as we all know, ODPHP, which drives the dietary guidelines work for HHS with us here at USDA. As Director of ODPHP, in addition to the dietary guidelines, Dr. Wright provides leadership for Healthy People 2020 and oversees the recently released physical activity guidelines. Also important, we should all note. Please give a warm welcome to our friend, Dr. Don Wright.
Well, thank you all, and thank you, Mr. Lips, for opening today's session of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. As most of you know, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services works hand in hand with the U.S. Department of Agriculture in the creation and development of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. USDA and HHS have worked collaboratively on the Dietary Guidelines for Americans since 1980, when the first edition was actually released. My office, the Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion, is the HHS lead for the Dietary Guidelines and works closely with the Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion at USDA. Mr. Lips, I'm very proud to say that my office and your office work so collaboratively, have in the past and will continue to work together collaboratively in support of the advisory committee work. Since 1990, the National Nutrition Monitoring and Related Research Act has mandated that the dietary guidelines be republished by USDA and Health and Human Services at least every 5 years. This particular legislation is important because it ensures that the dietary guidelines remain a priority for both departments. The law stipulates that each edition of the dietary guidelines should be based on the preponderance of the scientific evidence and medical knowledge current at the time and should be used as the basis for federal food programs. This drives us to work continually to improve the rigor of the process and underlies the guidelines and to ensure that all programs related to food, nutrition, and health are based on the strongest scientific evidence. As you probably know, health promotion and disease prevention is a top priority for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. To that end, nutrition guidance based on rigorous scientific research and evidence is critical to the health and well-being of our nation. At HHS, our agencies use the dietary guidelines in a variety of ways. Certainly the dietary guidelines are used for current guidance delivered through our grant programs and through our educational materials. They're also used in our food assistance programs like the Older Americans Act nutrition programs. They're used in our national health objectives such as the nutrition and weight status objectives in the Healthy People Initiative. They're used in nutrition monitoring and research, and certainly they're used in the regulatory processes related to food labeling and fortification. Over the years, the dietary guidelines development process has continued to evolve and to reflect advances in nutrition science and to increase the transparency of the entire process. Last year, in 2018, USDA and HHS introduced a new step in the process. We asked the public as well as our federal agencies, for comments on proposed topics and scientific questions to guide the work of the committee. We received over 12,000 comments on these topics and questions and considered the comments based on criteria such as the importance of, as related to public health, or the potential impact on our federal food programs. To the committee, HHS and USDA hope that the final topics and questions will help streamline the work of the committee by focusing on the evidence related to nutrition and a wide variety of health outcomes across the lifespan. For example, the committee will be reviewing evidence on the relationship between dietary patterns consumed at each stage of life and the risk of development of cardiovascular disease, of type 2 diabetes, and of certain types of cancer. Without question, this is a very important work. The public can also view all the topics and questions, including public comment on those initially proposed, on www.dietaryguidelines.gov. Everyone will hear more about the topics and questions at tomorrow's session. We may all work in different areas of health, but we all share a common mission to enhance the health and well-being of all Americans. Unfortunately, too many Americans engage in behaviors such as unhealthy food choices and physical inactivity that lead to poor health. As a result, 60% of adults in the United States have a chronic disease, and 40% of adults have 2 or more chronic diseases. But in that news, there is good news. We know many chronic diseases, including obesity, can be prevented through both a healthy diet and through physical activity. HHS recently published the second edition of the Physical Activity Guidelines for Americans. We released those in November of 2018. My office, the Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion, led this initiative using a similar advisory committee with subject matter experts in the area of exercise. Move Your Way is a promotional campaign to encourage the public to meet the recommendations listed in the Physical Activity Guidelines for Americans. Preventing chronic disease like obesity, type 2 diabetes, and cancer are very important public health priorities within HHS and to our agencies, especially to the National Institute of Health, the Food and Drug Administration, and the Center for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta. Nutrition is a key focus in the Healthy People Initiative, which my office leads on behalf of Secretary Azar. For almost 40 years, Healthy People has been providing science-based national objectives with ambitious yet achievable goals for improving the health of the nation. In this way, Healthy People can serve in many ways as a roadmap for the nation's health prevention and disease prevention activities. Healthy People is very much about understanding where we are now, planning for where we want to be in the future, and then providing guidance on how we can make those improvements over the next decade. The Dietary Guidelines helps to inform the foundation of the nutrition and weight status goals and objectives within the Healthy People 2020 and the soon-to-be released Healthy People 2030 initiative. For example, the Healthy People 2020 objectives promotes increasing the consumption of fruits, vegetables, and whole grains in the diet. Other objectives provide goals and targets to reduce the consumption of saturated fats and added sugars over the decade. Healthy People 2020 also aims to reduce the proportion of children and adults who are obese. Let me say another office within HHS, the Office of Women's Health, is looking forward to the Advisory Committee's science-based recommendation to promote women's health across the lifespan. We know that proper nutrition during the earliest stages of life is critical to support healthy growth and development during childhood and to promote health and prevent chronic disease throughout adulthood. Because of this, the committee will examine questions focused on infants and toddlers from birth to age 2 and women during pregnancy and lactation. Certainly, your work will help ensure that a strong scientific foundation underlies the dietary guidelines we provide for all Americans across the lifespan. Well, in closing, I want to take just a minute to thank you for your willingness to serve on this committee. It is truly a labor of love, and I do think the impact of your work is very large and has the opportunity to improve the health of the nation. So thank you for your willingness to serve. I did want to say that the Assistant Secretary for Health, Admiral Jirwa, was unfortunately unable to be here today, but he sends his well wishes as well as his thank you. I'm very pleased and confident that this group has the right expertise. We have the right people at the table to carry out the committee's charge, and I know your work will be instrumental in helping the people of the United States of America live healthier and longer lives. I look forward to working with all of you over the next year and a half as you review the scientific basis. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Dr. Rod. I will say that we do have a great partnership, and I do believe that the two departments working together helps to make this a better and more robust process as we move forward. So we appreciate you and your staff in that partnership. I now have the pleasure of introducing a colleague from here at USDA, Dr. Scott Hutchins. As we discussed earlier, we are taking all the opportunities we can to increase the transparency and the science-based portions of this process. The Agricultural Research Service, under the direction of Dr. Hutchins, is going to help us do that as we move forward. Dr. Hutchins is the Deputy Undersecretary for USDA's Research, Education, and Economics Mission Area, which, as I mentioned, includes the Agricultural Research Service, and it is now part of our Dietary Guidelines team. Dr. Hutchins was sworn in by USDA Secretary Perdue in January of this year and joined USDA after 32 years at Corteva Agriscience. He is also an adjunct professor of entomology at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And with that, we'd like you to come provide us a few remarks, Dr. Hutchins.
Thank you, Mr. Lips, for that introduction, and good morning. And thank you all for joining us here today for this inaugural event. And I also want to make a special thanks to the committee for their service and for all the work that will be occurring over the next 14 months. It will be indeed critical to us, but also I know a tremendous amount of work on their part, and we look forward to the output. I was sworn in, as indicated, on January 29th by Secretary Perdue as the Deputy Undersecretary for this mission area. And since that time, I've been really busy learning and gaining perspectives from a number of stakeholders on a number of topics, including this topic, which I'm very pleased to help sponsor on behalf of the USDA with Mr. Lips. And since I've joined, I have been pleased to have the opportunity to work with so many dedicated colleagues within the USDA. My background is in entomology. I'm an entomologist and have a past career in the private sector, as you indicated. And I've always known about the talent of USDA scientists and their dedication to their mission throughout my career. But to be here and to see it firsthand has been truly inspiring. And I could not be more proud to be part of their team. REE, as we call it, Research, Education, and Economics, is a research-based organization, as the name implies. And I strongly believe that research matters. Science-based and data-driven is the mantra for REE and also for Secretary Perdue. And it should characterize also the focus of this committee and process, as indicated in the mission. Indeed, the systematic review of scientific evidence is a critical and invaluable part of any deliberative process. Humans have evolved as a species over millennia, not in 5-year increments. And evolution doesn't work that way. Individuals don't evolve, populations evolve. But what does change continuously is our knowledge and understanding of science through research and how to interpret those new learnings and decipher the complex interactions to better inform policies. So the work of this committee is critical in that regard. But what is unique to humans as a species is our ability to choose and the freedom to choose. And that freedom provides us the opening to provide guidance with those choices. And I recognize that there are a lot of opinions out there and a lot of different perspectives to draw upon. I have it actually in my own family. I have 3 grown children, all well-educated and all responsible adults. One is a vegetarian, one is a frequent meat consumer, and one is an omnivore. All three are content in their choices, and what's most important to me is that they're all respectful of each other and their choices. From these three families, I have 7 grandchildren, age 6 and under. And in their raising from my children, they are ensuring at every meal that they have a well-balanced opportunity and are focused on nutrition for their children. Just a few words about the mission area I want to share with you because I think it will be useful to this committee. We have 4 agencies within the Research, Education, and Economics mission area. The National Institute for Food and Agriculture, or NIFA, sponsors research at universities across the country, especially in 1862 and 1890 land-grant institutions. Cutting-edge research. The Economic Research Service is also part of this mission area, and it collects and analyzes data on food availability and has created just a tremendous amount of information and reports that can be supportive of this committee and implementation. The National Agricultural Statistics Service generates crop forecasts and plays an important role in helping with pricing and other types of information. And the Intramural Research Organization for USDA, the Agricultural Research Service, or ARS, generates the foundational information for surveillance of dietary intake and nutritional status. These 4 agencies, along with the Office of the Chief Scientist, combines and provides the guidance to the department on a number of topics, including these from a science and research standpoint. USDA has maintained food composition data, for example, since 1891. This task was recently totally revised with the creation of the Food Data Central, a one-stop shop website for all data products related to food composition and delivery dietary surveys. In partnership with the Centers for Disease Control, the Agricultural Research Service analyzes food intake reports and calculates nutrient intakes for all age groups, identifying shortfall or excess nutrients which can be correlated against a variety of health endpoints. This dietary component is called What We Eat in America and is the only nationally representative snapshot of the changing dietary habits and nutrient intake for Americans, and I believe will be useful to this committee. Mission area scientists stand ready to assist the committee in mining these databases as needed, and with newly expanded scope to include children from birth to 24 months and pregnant women, we can support the new amount of information as well in support of this committee. At USDA, we are for sound science and the preponderance of quality evidence as the basis for your recommendations. I welcome the committee to not only analyze what we have, but to provide support to us in identifying important gaps in knowledge that you find in the course of your work so that will help guide the research community in efforts for the future to fill such gaps. Research is a priority of USDA. Secretary Perdue, who has stated clearly the departmental goals that he wants to provide all Americans access to a safe, nutritious, and secure food supply. He says it this way, we're here to do right and feed everyone, and in that sense, we again thank you for your service. We welcome the guest and look forward to the stakeholder input, and we thank you for your contribution and your involvement.
Thanks, Dr. Hutchins. I think the only thing standing between us and a break is a photo opportunity. So I'm not sure. We have a very cozy stage, which I actually like. I like to have our teams at the smallest table we can get in so we can sit around and debate, and I hope you will have plenty of opportunity to do that. But with that, I want Dr. Hutchins and Dr. Wright to join me in the committee up at the center of the stage, and I think our colleagues will tell us where to stand. Thank you all very much. Are these guys going to stay seated?
Yeah.
And those here in the audience, you're welcome to stay or you're welcome to break, and we'll reconvene at 10:15.
I know you have to know. So what institution are you? What institution are you?
If we could get some of your chairs, could you stand, please? We're gonna grab some of your chairs. If you could grab 4 chairs here.
Logistics is always the hardest part. So we were waiting for 10:15 for the few stragglers who were all out based on our former commitment timeline. I just wanted to take a minute. I am not always real good about reading from my script, but I did this morning, and staff are not good about bragging on themselves when they write your comments, but they really keep the wheels turning on this front and have done a lot of work to get us to this place. So I would like to ask all of the USDA and HHS staff to stand up, and let's take a moment and recognize them for their hard work. Thank you all very much. It's been a lot of work to get to this point, and we have a long way to go. With that, I will leave the stage and let y'all get on with your program. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lips. Okay, so we are going to get right in and start talking about the committee's charter, operations, and in timeline. And again, my name is Eve Studi, and I'm the designated federal officer for this 2020 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. So we are going to start with the foundation. Dr. Wright did speak to this as well. The dietary guidelines are mandated under the National Nutrition Monitoring and Related Research Act, which was passed in 1990. And the bullets here are verbatim from that act. That act requires the dietary guidelines to contain nutritional and dietary information and guidelines for the general public, that they will be published jointly by the Secretaries of Agriculture and Health and Human Services at least every 5 years, and that they will be promoted by each federal agency in carrying out any federal food, nutrition, or health program, and finally, that they will be based on the preponderance of the scientific and medical knowledge which is current at the time it is prepared. And those things really do inform our process, thinking about the preponderance of evidence, speaking to the general public, making them applicable to Americans. And you'll see those things really informed kind of criteria that's used in our systematic review process, as well as the data that's used to inform the process as well. Now, some of you may also know about the Agricultural Act of 2014. It mandates the inclusion of infants and toddlers and women who are pregnant, beginning with the 2020-2025 Dietary Guidelines for Americans. Now, historically, the dietary guidelines have really focused on Americans ages 2 years and older. Some of the earlier editions did speak to pregnancy. Really, all the editions have spoken to pregnancy to a certain extent. Infants and toddlers were addressed in some of the earlier editions, but then later, it's been 2 years and older. However, that evidence base has continued to grow, and really for the past, I would say about 10 years, the departments have kind of had this, there's been this kind of discussion around should we expand to include these age groups. And then the Agricultural Act passed in 2014, which really mandated that to occur. So the upcoming edition will cover the entire lifespan from birth through older adulthood, and we're really excited about that change. It's resulted in, we have new experts. This committee is the largest committee we've ever had, and that's to reflect that expertise. And that has also allowed us to, within our federal staff, and we'll talk more about that, we have a number of federal staff who have expertise in that area that have come into this process as well, and I think it'll make it an even stronger process. This Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee is what's called a discretionary committee. We're not required to do it. The departments have asked to have this committee. It is established to accomplish a specific task, and as it has been noted before, this committee has been established to provide independent, science-based advice and recommendations to be considered by USDA and HHS in the development of the next edition of the Dietary Guidelines. This committee is formed and governed under what is known as the Federal Advisory Committee Act. We note that just because there are formal processes. There are formal processes for establishing the committee, how you operate, how we oversee your work, and how your termination, which sounds very dramatic, but the ending of the committee's work. So there are rules and processes, and so we'll work to help ensure that this process stays within the Federal Advisory Committee Act. Members of this committee are appointed as special government employees. There's another type of member, which is called a representative member. And special government employees are selected really based on your recognized expertise and expert knowledge relevant to this committee. And so you are asked to review the evidence as independent scientists and not representing a specific viewpoint. As a part of the Federal Advisory Committee Act, a charter must be filed with Congress before a Federal Advisory Committee can meet or take any action. The charter for the 2020 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee was filed with Congress on October 5th of 2018, and it describes the advisory committee's purpose, duties, and general operations. That charter is available at dietaryguidelines.gov. We have previously shared this charter with the committee as well. And if you go to dietaryguidelines.gov, you click on the Resources tab, and you can see a link directly to the charter. Okay, so as noted, one of the things that the charter describes is the committee's objectives and scope. And you will see us talk about this at every meeting. This is really the governing what the departments are asking the committee to do. And so we will come back to this regularly. You'll see it presented at every meeting. The 2020 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee will examine the evidence on specific topics and scientific questions identified by the departments. We'll talk a little bit about those in the next slide, and then again in a presentation tomorrow. Then, after reviewing the evidence, develop a report that outlines its science-based review and recommendations to the department with your scientific justification for those recommendations. At the end of this scientific review, you will submit your report, you'll develop that report and submit that report to the Secretaries of the Department of Agriculture and Health and Human Services for consideration as the departments develop the next edition of the Dietary Guidelines. Now, to those specific topics and supporting scientific questions, Dr. Wright spoke to this a little bit in his opening remarks, but for this round, for the first time, we identified the topics and questions before establishing the committee. And we'll talk a bit why we took that route here later this afternoon. These topics and questions were identified by the departments, but with federal input as well as public comments. They reflect a continued focus on patterns of what we eat and drink as a whole, on average and over time, now from birth into older adulthood. And just briefly, the topic areas look at dietary patterns, beverages, added sugars, dietary fats, seafood, frequency of eating, and of course questions focusing on the birth to 24 months and pregnancy and lactation. Those topics and questions are also available now at dietaryguidelines.gov. We posted those in September of last year, so they are available for viewing there at this time. Okay, the committee's task is time limited. The committee will terminate after delivery of its final report to the secretaries of USDA and HHS, or 2 years from the date the charter was filed with Congress, and that's a requirement of FACA. And so again, the date that the charter was filed with Congress was October 5th of last year. So either the report submitting or that date, whichever comes first. We do want to note that while the charter was filed in October, the departments request the committee's report by May of 2020. That is to allow the departments to meet the mandate to release the next edition of the Dietary Guidelines within 5 years of the last edition, which means that we need to release the Dietary Guidelines by December of 2020. So we're asking you to complete this work by May so that we have that time to meet that mandate. The committee is expected to hold 5 meetings, and we are excited for the very first time to be identifying those meeting dates at the beginning of the process. This is the first time we've ever done this. Usually we plan them as we go. With such a large committee of fantastic experts, it was really necessary to try to get these on your calendars as soon as possible. And also, we hope that it allows the public to follow along in the process as well and to plan for these meetings. So the meeting dates are here. I will also show them a couple other times today. The meetings will be held in Washington, D.C. We do plan for the 4th meeting to be out of the D.C. area in Houston, Texas. So to go out of the usual DC hotspot. And then 2 of the meetings will have the opportunity for oral comments to the committee. So that'll be the meeting in July and the meeting in January. We'll have the opportunity for the public to register to provide oral comments to the committee. Now, I will say registration is not open yet So I'd love for y'all to be really excited about this, but we'll announce registration as that becomes available and as we get to the individual meetings. And we'll announce that through dietaryguidelines.gov and through our listserv, and I'll talk more about how to sign up for that here in a bit. So we hope that having these dates really does help you follow the process and plan for engagement. The committee's charter does allow for the formation of subcommittees. Those subcommittees should be composed of members of the parent committee, so these 20 members dividing into groups of subcommittees, and that's to help it accomplish its objectives and to help facilitate this review of the evidence. So the purpose of the subcommittees is to review the evidence and then provide advice to the parent committee. So the subcommittees aren't speaking to the departments directly. You're working as subcommittees, reporting that information to the parent committee, the full committee. Ultimately, your recommendation, your report, is on behalf of the whole committee to the departments. Each subcommittee will conduct its work together between the meetings of the full committee and will provide updates for deliberation and decisions during the public meetings. So we really encourage you, this conversation needs to happen in a public forum, having discussion and deliberations across the committee, and so that will be the expectation. I think this meeting, there's a lot of presentations of us talking about the process, and future meetings will include a lot more discussion of your just review of the evidence, where you are, things that need to be discussed at the full committee, so that at the end of the day, when you submit your report, everybody has been engaged and understands the recommendations that are being made by the committee. I do want to note, as Mr. Lips had staff stand up, we do have a number of staff who will be helping to support the committee, but the ultimate conclusions and recommendations are of the committee. So we are here to help facilitate the work, to ensure that we follow processes, but at the end of the day, it's your report and the committee's recommendations to us. Now, I do want to note that public comments are accepted throughout the committee's deliberations and on their report. We'll talk more about this at the end of the day when we talk about opportunities for public engagement, but do want to note that this is, in addition to just being more deliberative, it is a requirement of the Federal Advisory Committee Act. And so we will have public comments, I think as Dr. Wright noted, opened on March 12th. And it will continue throughout the committee's deliberations. So at any time you can go in and provide written public comments to the committee. You can find that link. We do it through regulations.gov, but you can go to dietaryguidelines.gov and access that information. I think so far we've gotten like 49 public comments. So, if the public has comments, we encourage you to submit them through that route. I do want to note that the committee did complete an administrative training prior to this meeting. That meeting included an introduction to the Federal Advisory Committee Act from a USDA committee management officer. It included ethics training by USDA Office of Ethics staff. It included guidance on interactions with media from the USDA Food and Nutrition Services Office of Communications. And I'll say just generally, committee members are asked not to speak on behalf of the committee. So if if stakeholders reach out to them with information, they will request that information be submitted through the public comment process, and that's to allow it to be a part of the official record and to be a part of the official process. When there are immediate requests, those are directed to the departments and to only discuss information that is publicly available. And really, those are elements that are requirements around FACA, but also as their appointments as special government employees. I will note that slides from that administrative training will be posted at dietaryguidelines.gov when we post the information for this public meeting. Okay, creating the dietary guidelines, as has already been talked about by our leadership, is a partnership between USDA and HHS. I do want to note that, and some of you may know that the responsibility for serving as the administrative lead rotates every 5 years. So we're at USDA today because USDA is serving as the administrative lead for the 2020 edition, just as HHS served as the administrative lead for the 2015 process. However, as has been noted by our leadership, this is very much a partnership. And we will continue to work together in creating the final edition, the edition of the 2020 dietary guidelines as well. Now, within the departments, the USDA Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion within the Food Nutrition Service and the HHS Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion play lead roles in the dietary guidelines process. Just to note that these two offices are led by Jackie Haven for the Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion and Dr. Wright from ODPHP. Within those offices, we have a number of staff that this is what we do year-round, all the time. And whether we have a committee in place or not, we're preparing for the next committee. We are looking at process improvements. We are developing websites. So it's something that we do. It's literally part of our job description, is supporting of the dietary guidelines at all times. And it's communications and all the different elements that comes with this work. We are also very pleased to have some federal liaisons supporting this process who've really come on to support the committee. So to support the work of the committee. Some of those are with USDA and also from agencies within HHS, including FDA, CDC, and NIH. And then there are additional staff, other staff, and one of our things is trying to really identify roles and responsibilities and distributing workload and responsibilities. We will have staff who are specifically focused on supporting the review of evidence, and those will be identified in presentations later today. And then finally, to note, we do have a science writer who will help support in the development of your report, and we have worked with her in a few different rounds, and she's been wonderful to work with. So we'll have that support as well. So just in closing, again, the committee has a very important role, which I think you've heard several of us speak to so far, and that is to describe the state of current nutrition science. Each edition of the dietary guidelines that the departments develop build upon the previous edition with scientific justifications provided and informed by your work. That your report, your final report, will ultimately also be posted for public comment on your report. And again, there's public and agency comment. But at the end of the day, this is really a foundational piece for providing scientific justification for changes. As you've heard too, we really thank you for this work. I think there's been comments that everybody keeps saying it's a lot of work. So it is a lot of work, and we really do appreciate your time, your expertise, and we look forward to receiving your report. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions, if you have any at this time, related to the charter, the timeline, or your operations. All right, and you always know where to find me if you have questions. So, okay, so I'm now so pleased to introduce the chair of the 2020 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, Dr. Barbara Schneeman. Dr. Schneeman's distinguished career in nutrition science and chronic disease prevention reflects diverse experience tackling the complex issue from multiple perspectives. It includes 28 years at the University of California, Davis, serving in leadership roles nationally, including with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, and lending her expertise to influential committees and internationally, such as the Food and Agricultural Organization and the World Health Organization. At UC Davis, Dr. Schneeman educated food science students on nutrition principles and food policies, trained graduate students in food nutrition sciences, and conducted research on dietary factors associated with reducing risk of chronic disease. For 9 years, she served as the director of the Office of Nutrition Labeling and Dietary Supplements at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Dr. Schneeman also importantly brings seasoned insights into the dietary guidelines process specifically. She served as a member of the 1990 and 95 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committees, and more recently, she served as a member of the National Academy Study on the process to establish the dietary guidelines, which completed its work in 2017. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Schneeman.
Thank you, Eve. I'm going to take the prerogative to sit with the committee. Seems appropriate. And so, first of all, let me extend my thank you to the committee members for your agreement to serve on this committee. It is a major commitment of time and talent. I will echo or reinforce what you've been hearing. But I have to say, seeing the outstanding roster of experts who have agreed to serve made the decision to serve as chair much easier. I feel I have a good group to work with. And I also want to recognize the expertise and experience of the staff who will be working with the committee. You all are an incredibly valuable resource for the task ahead of us. And Dr. Studi and the officials that we heard earlier and the officials that we heard earlier from HHS and USDA have certainly presented the significance of the dietary guidelines themselves for the federal government programs. And from my experience, I know how important they are in shaping programs. And they've also clearly outlined the elements that are key to the task of this committee. So in considering the task ahead of us, I just wanted to emphasize a few principles that are important to me in moving the work forward and keeping us on task. Certainly that importance of understanding the committee's charter. What we will hear about the topics and questions, this is what we've been asked to provide independent scientific evaluation, and we need to focus on that work. Also, the evaluation of the available science is central to our task. And whenever possible, we will make conclusions and recommendations based on that evaluation. This central task will rely both on the expertise of the committee members as well as the support of the staff to make sure we're reviewing the relevant data and studies to answer the questions that are in the topics and questions. And then as a third point, I do want to make sure that we abide by the legal framework of the Federal Advisory Committee Act. Having worked for the federal government, I know how important it is for the credibility of our work to adhere to those requirements. And certainly we've learned more in our training, where we've heard more about it today. And I think a reminder that you'll hear often is, while we will be using subcommittees for our working groups because we have to progress the work between meetings, the decision-making process and the deliberation that the committee as a whole will go through will be a part of the public process, and that's to make sure we're consistent with the FACA requirements. So related to these principles and some of what we've been hearing, this first meeting of the committee has been structured to both inform the committee about the topics and scientific questions, the evidence that is available and that we can tap into, and how it will be examined and evaluated, and to obtain input from the committee on several items to establish our framework for the committee's work, and that the subcommittees can then rely on for their work to bring things forward to the parent committee. I can't emphasize enough how fortunate we are to have the support of expert staff from USDA and HHS, many of whom you will be hearing from today and tomorrow, and have the opportunity to gain more insight and also ask your questions. And again, to be part of that public deliberation to ask those questions. So I'm also very pleased that Dr. Kleinman has agreed to serve as the vice chair for the committee, given that this is the first DGAC that has been asked to review and make recommendations for pregnancy, lactation, and B through 24. His expertise will be valuable in guiding the committee's deliberations and decision-making in this area. Dr. Kleinman brings vast experience as an esteemed pediatrician who has served in many leadership roles. Nutrition support of infants and children and nutrition and public health policy are among his major research interests. He is currently chair of the Massachusetts General Hospital's Department of Pediatrics, physician-in-chief of the Mass General Hospital for Children, and a Charles Wilder Professor of Pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. He served as the chair of the AAP Committee on Nutrition and is the editor of the Academy's Pediatric Nutrition Handbook. Dr. Kleinman has served on numerous scientific advisory committees and boards, from several committees for the National Academy of Sciences on maternal and child health and obesity prevention for young children, as well as adolescent health and development, to serving on the Scientific Advisory Committee for the Sesame Street Workshop since 2009. I think of special importance for our work, Dr. Kleinman served as chair of the Workshop Planning Committee for the Dietary Guidelines Birth to 24-Month Project from 2012 to 2013 and brings that expertise to us. So I'll let you make some opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I'm going to keep my remarks very brief and just perhaps add a little bit to what you've already said. First, I really do appreciate this opportunity to work with all of you on this project. We'll call it a project. I think it's a wonderful opportunity to learn for me and also for us collectively to be able to evaluate the evidence base that's evolved since the last dietary guidelines, the current dietary guidelines came out. And in particular, to see or provide advice on how this evidence base can inform the implementation of these into guidelines. On a personal and professional note, I am a pediatrician and have spent most of my professional career in research in the field of nutrition. But to echo what some of the previous speakers have said, I am a father, and I know it's hard to believe, I'm a grandfather as well. So both from a professional and personal position, I'm very excited that these guidelines will now incorporate the entire lifespan from pregnancy right through the early periods of life. This isn't a new concept. I was looking for a quote and I came upon one by Frederick Douglass, so that goes back over 150 years. And to paraphrase him, he said, it's easier to build strong children than to mend broken adults. And so from that, we have finally come to the point where we recognize the importance of what I think most people now call the first 1,000 days, and how environmental factors, and in particular nutrition, influences the development of all of the systems that not only have immediate impact on the life of the child, but impact the development of health and disease later in life. So I'm approaching this with really so much enthusiasm to see how we look at the evidence base and come up with some recommendations for that period of life. So that's about all I have to say. A mentor of mine once said that at some point in a conversation, everything that needs to be said has been said. It's just that everybody hasn't said it yet. And so hopefully we'll be able to conduct our business that way.
Great. Okay.
So, thank you, Dr. Schneeman and Dr. Kleinman. We are going to adjust our schedule a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and give the presentation about responding to the National Academy's report since we are running a little bit ahead. So I'm going to put that up on the slide presentation, and then we'll pause 1 second, and then we'll reconvene here in just literally 2 minutes. Okay, I hope everybody had a great lunch. No. Yeah, it's just a little shuffle in the agenda. One of the things we wanted to do was to have do a presentation around the National Academy's report on the process to update the dietary guidelines. So we'll spend some time walking through that here today. In 2016, Congress directed a comprehensive study on the process to update the dietary guidelines. USDA then commissioned the National Academy's Health and Medicine Division to undertake this study. The Health and Medicine Division did convene a 14-member committee that conducted this independent study for 18 months. 3 members of our Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee also served as members of that HMD committee, Dr. Schneeman, Dr. Ard, and Dr. Boucher. That study concluded in 2 reports. The first on optimizing the process for establishing the dietary guidelines, and it was really focused on the advisory committee. So the selection process for establishing this committee. And then the second report was really on the remaining aspects or the larger aspects of the process. And so it was a broader scope and covered everything kind of beyond the selection process. Those 2 reports were released in February and September of 2017. So just to start off, USDA and HHS thank the National Academies and the committee for their work and recommendations. And again, USDA was commissioned to do the report, and that's why we asked HMD to do it. But the report was to both departments, and both departments have worked together in responding to the recommendations. So we want to speak a bit about how these recommendations, how we respond to these recommendations for the 2020 process. Some of the things that we considered when reviewing the recommendations was conforming with relevant laws and regulations. So we've already talked a bit about the Federal Advisory Committee Act, and that was something that we had to think about and look at the recommendations in relation to that act. Also, federal ethics laws and regulations. There were some things that really had input from our ethics, how conflicts of interest are defined and how we work within the discussion around conflicts of interest. We also considered time and resources. We're mandated to develop the dietary guidelines every 5 years, so how do we fit these pieces within the process, and particularly for this process? So what we'll talk about today relates specifically to this advisory committee and the 2020 dietary guidelines. We also talked about potential implications on other federal advisory committees. There are currently 400 active committees within USDA and HHS, and so things that we do in this advisory committee can impact other advisory committee processes. So we kind of looked at it with a larger global perspective as well. And then we also had input from stakeholder listening sessions. So after the reports were released, USDA and HHS hosted a listening session where a number of stakeholders came in and provided input around those recommendations. And the transcripts from those listening sessions are available on CMPP's website. The reports did provide overarching values and then specific process recommendations. So there were 5 values that they recommended to improve the integrity of the process to develop credible and trustworthy guidelines. And those 5 values are to enhance transparency, to promote diversity of expertise and experience, to support a deliberative process, to manage biases and conflicts of interest, and to adopt state-of-the-art processes and methods. Overall, USDA and HHS support these values and will continue to integrate steps to address these goals. Even when we were going through the individual recommendations, we'd come back to these values and kind of think about, are there elements that we can address related to these values? I will say these have been values that we have worked towards prior to the report, but it was nice to see those kind of affirmed in the committee's report, kind of informing our process as we move forward. Now, I will say that the first report included 4 recommendations, and the second report included 7 recommendations. And I'm literally going to walk through each of the recommendations, talk about what the recommendation was, and our response to that recommendation. So it will be a little recommendation after recommendation, but we really felt like it deserved the time to kind of walk through each one and talk about our response to those recommendations. So the first recommendation related to, and again, the first report was around establishing the committee. So the first recommendation was that the Secretaries of Agriculture and Health and Human Services should employ an external third party that would help narrow down the list of nominations to develop a primary and alternate list of nominees for consideration by the departments in establishing the committee. So again, this was really historically, in the way this is typically done, is the departments receive nominations and the departments select the committee. And the recommendation here was for the departments to receive the nominations, but for us to ask a third party to narrow down the list to a kind of a primary and secondary kind of slate. Now, our response, due to resource limitations, really around cost and time, we did not utilize a third party for the committee selection process. I should note there were other elements to the recommendation around establishing criteria for the advisory committee, and that is something that we did do. We did develop screening criteria. That criteria was included with our call for nominations, so we were telling people these are the criteria that we are looking at when we're looking at the individual nominees. They related to, there were criteria around the educational background, professional experience, demonstrated scientific expertise, obligations under the Federal Advisory Committee Act, and requirements regarding a balanced membership. One of the other things, kind of going back to that value of transparency as well, we now provide more information on our website on the process that we use within the departments to establish the committee. So again, identifying those criteria in advance and then just telling people more. We've always had processes, we just haven't necessarily described them, and that has been something that we're working to do, is add more transparency through our website. The second recommendation was that the secretaries of USDA and HHS should make a list of provisional appointees open for public comment, including short biographies and any known conflicts for a reasonable period of time prior to appointment. We did explore incorporating this recommendation. However, in the interest of provisional appointees, the departments chose not to implement this recommendation out of privacy concerns. And specifically, there wasn't a way that we could guarantee, those comments could have been made public, and we didn't want to subject potential committee members to kind of being within, having all of those comments in a public space. The third recommendation was that the Secretaries of Agriculture and Health and Human Services should disclose how provisional nominees' biases and conflicts of interest are identified and managed, and there were 4 elements to this. The first was by creating and publicly posting a policy and form to explicitly disclose financial and non-financial biases and conflicts. The second was to develop a management plan for addressing biases and conflicts for the panel as a whole and individuals as needed. The third, certifying that a federal ethics officer independently reviewed and judged the advisory committee's biases and conflicts of interest. And then finally, documenting how conflicts of interest were managed in the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report. Related to this recommendation, we just want to note that we agree that managing potential conflicts of interest and minimizing bias is essential to this process. USDA and HHS do work to assess and manage potential conflicts of interest and work to minimize bias through a number of different steps in our processes, and I'll walk through a few of these here. First, during the committee selection process, all of the individuals who were under final consideration for the committee were asked to submit a confidential financial disclosure report, a form known as the OGE 450. And that form is publicly available on the web. So everybody was asked to do that prior to selection. Historically, the way advisory committees have been formed, that step is done after you've been appointed. So after members are appointed, they do the conflict of interest. In this case, we did it before. So before you were even selected, before we had done final identification of members, that step was taken. That completed report was reviewed by ethics officials within the USDA Office of Ethics. And then we also, in this round, asked for some specific information in nomination packages. And so typically, send a 10, 15-page CV, and we really ask for specific information: education, employment, peer-reviewed publications, presentations, blogs, funding sources, other affiliations. And we really did this for awareness, but also to support establishing a committee with broad representation and balance across many different considerations. So it was really helpful in our process to kind of see the broad range of elements in the CVs. So that was during committee selection. During committee service, the USDA ethics official will conduct annual review of each member's conflict of interest form. Ethics training will also be provided to the committee annually. We've already done that ethics training prior to this meeting for this year, and we'll do it again before the committee is terminated. In general, the approaches to examine evidence are protocol-driven. They're rigorous, they're objective, and those elements help to minimize bias. And the committee will ask the committee to also provide a summary of how it worked to manage potential conflicts of interest and minimize bias in its scientific report. The fourth recommendation was that the Secretaries of Agriculture and Health and Human Services should adopt a system for continuous process improvement to enhance outcomes and performance of the selection process, and we will continue to do this. We'll look at how this process worked. We've spent a lot of time talking to we have 400 other advisory committees. What is the process you use? Understanding how other agencies work in this space, and also reviewing best practices just across the nutrition community and medical community as well. Okay, so as I noted, the second report included 7 recommendations, so we have 7 more to go. That first recommendation was that the secretaries, and again, this is on the larger process beyond kind of the selection process, all the other elements. The Secretaries of Agriculture and Health and Human Services should redesign the dietary guidelines process to prioritize topics to be reviewed in each cycle, and then to redistribute the current functions of the advisory committee to 3 separate groups. And so first the 3 groups are the Dietary Guidelines Planning and Continuity Group, and that group would work to monitor and curate evidence generation, identify and prioritize topics, and then provide strategic planning support across the dietary guidelines cycles. The second was to convene what they called technical expert panels to provide content and methodological considerations during evaluation of the evidence. And the third was that the advisory committee, which they phrased the Dietary Guidelines Scientific Advisory Committee, would then interpret that scientific evidence and draw conclusions. Now, in response, 3 separate groups have not been established, again, part due to time and resource constraints in relation to establishing discretionary advisory committees. All of those would also have to be discretionary, which again, establishing one discretionary advisory committee is a process, and so to develop additional ones, and these would have to be federal advisory committees, is a process. Particularly the continuity group would be an advisory committee. So, however, in response to this recommendation and to support a more deliberative and transparent process, USDA and HHS, as you've heard and as we've discussed, with federal agency and public input, did identify the topics and questions to be examined by the committee prior to establishing the committee. So that act, doing the topics in question first, was in part due to the NASEM report, to kind of pull that out as a separate step. I do want to note that there are relevant existing nutrition evidence systematic review, which was formerly known as the NEL. There are existing NESR systematic reviews, including those conducted by the 2015 committee, as well as some that were completed by recent pregnancy and birth to 24 months technical expert collaboratives that are available for the committee's consideration. So they're relevant. They've addressed these topic areas and relate to the questions of interest. The second recommendation of the second report was that the Secretaries of Agriculture and Health and Human Services should provide the public with a clear explanation when the dietary guidelines omit or accept only parts of conclusions from the scientific report. And I'll say, as we've noted on our website, we'll continue to expand our response to these recommendations as we move into the respective steps. So we're quite just not there yet. So the departments will respond to this recommendation as we move to this phase. The third is that the Secretary of Agriculture should clearly separate the roles of the USDA Nutrition Evidence Library, now the NESR, staff and the Dietary Guidelines Scientific Advisory Committee, such that the NEL staff plan and conduct systematic reviews with input from technical expert panels, perform risk of bias assessment of individual studies, and assist the committee as needed. The NEL systematic reviews should be externally peer-reviewed prior to being made available for use by the committee, and that the committee synthesize and interpret the results of systematic reviews and draw conclusions about the entire body of evidence. Now, in response, I'll say that the roles and responsibilities of the NESR staff and the committee will be clearly outlined. Dr. Abaghi will talk a bit about the NESR process later today, and we'll continue that discussion about what the roles and responsibilities are. There are separation of responsibilities. Due to time and resource constraints, again, NESR will not be conducting, and this is just the point we made a minute ago, we won't be conducting systematic reviews with input from separate technical expert panels during the work of the committee. NESR will be working directly with the committee. However, as I noted, there are some relevant systematic reviews within kind of the NESR topics and questions they've done in the past that are relevant for the committee to consider. We do want to note that we did add a step, which is the peer review of the systematic reviews that you do, and Dr. Clearfield will speak to that later today. The Agricultural Research Service is going to help facilitate that peer review process. And that was to align with this recommendation and just generally align with best practices. The fourth recommendation is that the Secretary of Agriculture should ensure all nutrition evidence library systematic reviews align with best practices by enabling ongoing training of the NEL staff, enabling engagement with and learning from external groups at the forefront of systematic review methods, inviting external systematic review experts to periodically evaluate the NEL's methods, and to invest in technological infrastructure. The NESR team acknowledges that systematic review science and supporting technologies evolve continuously. NESR's continuous quality advancement initiative, so they have work where they do this already, involves enhancing staff knowledge and skills through ongoing training and professional development, leveraging the expertise in collaborating with methodologists from other leading systematic review organizations such as Cochrane, as well as the HHS, Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, or AHRQ. And they are working and do have steps that they'll speak to around expanding technological infrastructure. For the fifth recommendation was that the department should enhance the method known as food pattern modeling to better reflect the complex interactions involved, variability in intakes, and range of possible healthful diets. And the response is that food pattern modeling team has worked to transparently document its methods and incorporated the latest dietary intake data for analysis. The topics and questions that have been identified also allow for more explanation of variability in intakes across the lifespan, and examination of a range of possible healthful diets based on available evidence. And Dr. Tusa Rebecca Panucci will speak to that process later today. The sixth was that the Secretaries of Agriculture and Health and Human Services should standardize the methods and criteria for establishing nutrients of public health concern. And again, the data analysis team has worked to transparently document those steps first, and also to standardize those methods and criteria for establishing nutrients of concern. And that won't be discussed today in today's data analysis presentation, but it will be discussed, and there has been work to standardize those methods. And then finally, the National Academies Committee recommended that the department should commission research and evaluate strategies to develop and implement systems approaches into the dietary guidelines. The selected strategies should begin to be used to integrate systems mapping and modeling into the dietary guidelines process. And again, I will say that, and I think Dr. Wright mentioned too, we are continuously looking to add methods and to address kind of advances in reviewing science. So, for example, USDA established the Nutrition Evidence Systematic Review in 2008 because systematic reviews were really becoming the state-of-the-art approach for informing clinical and public health guidance. And so it is something that we are staying on top of and trying to advance. And I will say we have done some initial exploration into systems approaches, and we'll continue to explore this option. So just in closing, there are fact sheets that are available on our website with these recommendations and our responses. If you go to dietaryguidelines.gov and you click on resources, we've also been asked to submit a report to Congress with responses to these recommendations, and so we'll be doing that later this year. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions if there are questions on this topic.
I will make a comment, personal comment as a committee member. And having been involved with the recommendations from the National Academies, I am impressed with what you have been able to incorporate from the recommendations for this particular cycle. I think it's fair to say that the committee was concerned about the timing, how well things could be integrated. And I guess one thing that might affect the deliberation of our committee was the recommendation about thinking about it generally around those three committee structures, but generally the principle behind it was thinking about continuity over the cycles so that topics could be identified moving forward that needed to be addressed, and that some recommendations probably don't need to be addressed with each cycle. So I'd be interested in your comments about that concept of continuity and how the departments have thought of that.
I mean, we agree, and it has been something we have talked about. I think there has been this discussion of, do we need to address every topic every time? But that's a hard thing to, it's not easy to say which topics you're not addressing, because the field of nutrition, there's so much interest and there's research published every day on different topics. So it is, thinking about that mandate for the dietary guidelines to be based on the preponderance of current scientific evidence, being sure that we meet that mandate while also not duplicating or going into topic areas we don't need to necessarily re-examine. So I think that idea and part of the conversation on the federal level has been trying to think about, now we've added this emphasis around birth to 24. What's the emphasis in 2025? So I think we would like to have that more continuity, the concept of it or the principles behind it, I think we support. It's how to implement the infrastructure to get us to that goal and also to represent the preponderance of current science. So it's something we're definitely, we're talking about, and we already are thinking about kind of what can we do and steps that we can take to prepare for the 2025 process, and this is part of that conversation. All right. Any other questions? I will ask. Okay.
So thinking about this committee's work, the current DGAC committee's, it's not working. I'll try this one. There.
Yeah.
Thinking about this particular DGAC's committee's work, I anticipate that the public comments will grow as the process moves forward. And we've been given a set of topics and questions that the departments have asked us specifically to address. So if we see things that go beyond that mandate that the committee has, Is there a way that we can acknowledge the relevance of a topic or question, but not necessarily deal with it directly? I'm just thinking again in terms of how do we handle something like that in the framework of these recommendations?
Absolutely. So the committee is asked to limit its review of the evidence to the topics and questions that have been identified by the departments. If there are topics, we are looking at, we do this every 5 years. And so I think that if there are topics and questions that you feel that are relevant in this process, there is an opportunity to acknowledge those. It's really, we're asking you to focus your review of evidence on those topics and questions with which Janet DeJesus will speak to tomorrow. If there's anything beyond that, I think there can be a place in your report to speak to, we feel like in 2025, looking at X, Y, and Z. Yes, I think that's totally appropriate.
Sort of a correl. It's not working here. Oh, do you have to push the button? No. Well, as a corollary of that, given the topics, do we have the authority to request specific reviews? I mean, you are going to develop the database that we work on. What if we have ideas that additional data is necessary to answer the question well?
So, I'm not sure if I totally understand the question. You can work within the topics and questions. And
You're going to be preparing systematic reviews for us to work with, right?
with your input, yeah.
Okay, so we can request a review on a particular facet within our topic area
Within the topic.
that you may have not thought of yet.
That's part of the conversation, yeah.
Good.
With the subcommittees, yep, in the committee. Yeah, it's just staying within those topics and questions, but you'll be involved in part of the discussion tomorrow, for example, will be on discussion of which neurocognitive health outcomes to consider or which cancer outcomes to consider. So you are a group of experts brought together to inform those systematic reviews. Any other? Oh.
Is that on? How about that? Okay. In one of your slides, you mentioned 5 values to improve the integrity of the process, and one of those was support a deliberative process. What's a deliberative process?
Ask the committee. Well, I think the way that they spoke to it was that it had a lot of input. That it had input from the committee. I think for us it's that, we're not operating in isolation. The departments aren't operating in isolation. We have input from the committee. There is the public comment period. That there is the systematic review piece. That there are different elements. It's kind of many sources of evidence feeding into the process, that there are different roles and responsibilities, and that there are multiple pieces to developing the guidelines. But, y'all were on the committee, Dr. Schneeman, Art, and Boucher, if you would like to add to that. But for us, it's really been trying to make sure that we get input from various sources, that we took that topic and question process, the development of topics and questions outside of the committee process. It's kind of the division of responsibilities, having public input on that, kind of having a lot of input in different places.
I'll just add to that. I think part of that discussion too centered around the idea of diversity of thought within the committee, so that, from a deliberative standpoint, if everyone on the committee already has a predetermined perspective on topic X, then that's not deliberation, that's just consensus. And so the idea was, when you're constituting the committee, that we're looking not just at the typical conflicts of interest around associations with industry or those types of things, but also diversity of thought and perspective, and being able to say, if presented with scientific evidence that is contrary to my previous line of research, then I'm able to discuss that, deliberate on that, and then come to a conclusion that is based on the evidence.
sort of jumping off of what Dr. Kleinman said earlier, I'm struck with the fact that we're at this point pursuing the idea of initiating the dietary guidelines starting in pregnancy and at birth. And what an amazing opportunity it is to kind of track from the bigger picture, overarching question of prevention of something as chronic as obesity in this country. And while we're all about trying to meet nutrient needs, we're also trying to do it in a manner that is prevention-oriented. And I'm just curious, and maybe this will come up later during our deliberations specifically, but it is impressive to me that we have this opportunity to look at this upcoming generation of individuals who will be followed through this new movement in the establishment of these guidelines, and wondering, if there's a plan to look at some sort of tracking of this upcoming generation for that purpose, to determine whether these benefits can in fact influence health and longevity in years to come.
It is a fantastic research question. So maybe you can engage on that. Yes, I think that's a larger conversation, looking at the impact of the guidelines for this next generation after these guidelines come out. So I think it's separate from this specific process, but a very important part of the process. Yeah.
And perhaps thinking about what can be in the committee's report, I believe we can make research recommendations, that has been a standard part of the process.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's an important part, we think. It does help inform research that's done. So yeah, it's a very key part. Okay, so if there are no other questions, we will break for lunch, and please reconvene here at 12:45 to continue the discussion. So thank you. We'll come back and escort y'all to lunch here in just a second. We'll escort you to lunch. I'll go back to the back.
Faulty microphone somewhere? Someone's mic not working? It did. This one's dead. Yeah, that one.
Yeah, it's like the day I'm not ready.
Got to go get all the wraps on and everything. See, he's cold too. Because he's got his stocking cap on. Yeah, I think we were all four and go together out back of the wall. Anyway, that was really interesting. They actually rest. And I think that would be I know, it does.
Test, test. Testing, 1, 2. Testing.
No. Because no one's leaving tomorrow.
Test, test, test.
Question about the podium. They were asking for for this afternoon speakers, they want it like where they're talking to the committee members versus the audience, so she wanted it. Yeah. I didn't know if I'm allowed to touch it or not. And then, huh? Okay, that's what she was asking.
Testing, 1, 2.
Yeah, I think this would be fine. Like, yeah, this should be okay like that. So, okay. All right.